Seated. Grab your coffee. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, so I'm very happy that many of you could join us today, especially on such short notice. My name is Glenn Howard. I'm president of the Jamestown Foundation, and today's presentation is called Flashpoint, Crimea. We apologize for the fact that Mr. Jamestown could not be here. He has a very hectic schedule and is still in New York at the UN Security Council discussing the issue of Crimean Tatars, working with the Ukrainian government. So we're very happy that this is still with this type of group of great expertise on this very important region, Ukraine, Black Sea region, and all the former post-Soviet space, to have such an array of different opinions. My name is Glenn Howard again, president of Jamestown Foundation. I'd like to let you know that if you would like to tweet about today's event, the hashtag is JTF Crimea, and you can be following this event on Twitter at that hashtag. So I'd also like to thank Catherine Basinski of Jamestown Foundation, Matt Chikai, and David Cohen for helping us to organize and put on this event today. I think we would all benefit at this very important time for all the insights of what's going on with Ukraine and Crimea. There's a lot of different opinions and a lot of expertise in this room, and much of it is on the podium with us here today. I've had the benefit of having to talk to Pavel Bayev at great depth in the past couple days about the situation, and I've greatly benefited from my discussions with Pavel, and as well as talking to Steve and in constant interaction with Paul Goebel, and as well as Adil. I think there's four important questions today about the situation in Crimea and Ukraine that I hope that can be addressed, and I hope come out of today's discussion. And really, the first question is, what does the Crimean annexation mean for the West? Many of us have seen Secretary of State Kerry been criticized for no longer talking about Crimea, that it's almost a done deal now, but there's still 300,000 Crimean Tatars living in Crimea, unlike during the Soviet period when there was no Tatars on the peninsula. The strategic situation is much different today. Is it really too early to write off the Crimeans? If you judge by Jamestown's visits in New York and his discussions and presentations at the UN Security Council working with the Ukrainian government, one could get the impression that it's not a done deal. So we hope to learn more about that today from Adil in her presentation. And really what will happen to the Crimean Tatars, is it all going to be very calm and peaceful on the peninsula after the Anschluss? So that's some of the questions. And many of us who are experts on the Tatars, not myself, but those who are experts in the Crimean Tatars have often emphasized to me that it's not a done deal. The Crimean Tatars will never roll over and give up. They have fought hard for their status on the peninsula, and if you look at some of the booklets outside on the role of the Crimean Tatars during the Ottoman Empire, you see that they were very much a very powerful military mechanism of the Ottoman Empire, and known for their military expertise. So that's another issue to take in consideration. We don't know what's going to happen. The other issue that we want to talk about today is, will Putin decide to go into eastern Ukraine? I talked to Pavel Bayev yesterday at great length about this. We decided that would be his topic. We're now seeing a different, what some people are calling a pause after what happened with the annexation of Crimea, and now you're starting to see perhaps the start of a negotiated stage. But judging by NATO's statements today and Rasmussen's statement that the military buildup is continuing and there's no signs of a declining on the Russian side of the Ukrainian frontier, one could think that possibly that there's going to be further military, further use of military power by Russia to go into the Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. So this is an issue that we would like to talk about and address, and I think Paul will also go into. In the last and not least, but fourth issue that is going to be very important for us today is, how will the U.S. and NATO respond to further Russian aggression? It's an issue of debate right now, and there's no better person in this room to frame it strategically than Stephen Blank. And I'm not trying to take away our moderator's position here with Janusz Bogalski. I just wanted to raise these questions because there's a lot of issues and questions remaining that we don't know how this will evolve, and that's why we're here, is to kind of hear some opinions and views and to talk further about it. So on that note, the event is being videotaped and live streamed today. We thank you for all those that are joining in online. Remember to tweet about the conference if you have time. And I'll turn the platform now over to Janusz. Thank you, Janusz.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. You've saved me some time by introducing the panelists already. So I'll take the opportunity to make a few comments of my own as introduction before we go over to them. Let me just say a couple of things. I think although Putin's ambitions to create this Moscow-centered Eurasia Union are unlikely to succeed, given, I would say, the economic conditions, declining economic conditions in Russia itself, the resistance of neighboring countries, as we've witnessed. But what I would say is that attempts to create such a union, create such a bloc, could actually destabilize a broader region. I think this is what we are potentially witnessing in Ukraine. In other words, an attempt to draw Ukraine into some new Moscow orbit is having the exact opposite effect. In other words, it's creating regional instability. So, regarding Crimea, I would say Russia's de facto annexation begs many questions, obviously, about the indigenous Crimean Tatar nation, as well as the future of the population, future of the peninsula, the future of both Ukraine and Russia. And let me pose a few. Question number one. Will the Crimean Tatars be subjected to escalating collective repression as President Putin tightens the screws on dissent within the country? Can they be divided and bought by corrupt Russian officialdom, as have the Chechens and other nations in the North Caucasus, at least temporarily? Can the Tatars themselves become a source of resistance that may galvanize other non-Russian nations and Muslim populations in the Russian Federation to press for their own self-determination in other parts of Russia? Second set of questions, how will the status of Crimea affect relations between Ukraine and Russia? Irrespective of whether Moscow militarily invades mainland Ukraine, as Pavel is going to address, and engages in further attempts at partition. Will it cause a permanent rift and actually help bring Ukraine into the Western orbit? Will this serve to pull other states away from a neo-imperial Russia in order to avoid a similar Crimean-type scenario on their own territories? Third set of questions. Regarding Russia itself, does partition and annexation of a neighbor set direct precedents for the future partition of the Russian Federation? Will declining economic conditions, rising Russian ethno-nationalism, statism and militarism make conditions inside the Federation increasingly volatile? And fourth, how would we assess the Western response so far? And Steve, I think, is going to address this. Do we actually provoke Putin by demonstrating our economic and military strength, or by displaying our uncertainty and lack of resolve, not just to contain Russia, but to defend its most vulnerable neighbors? So I'll leave those four things out there. You can or may not address these questions, but maybe we can also in the discussion. So we have four outstanding cast of specialists. We'll start with Paul, then we'll go to Idil, Pavel, and Steve. So the floor is yours, Paul. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Glenn for inviting me. I am, as many of you know, a utility infielder when it comes to nationality issues. I was never given the privilege of focusing on any one of them in enough detail to have the expertise that the other speakers have. And so I'm going to speak more generally because, quite frankly, I think it's important that we not follow Mr. Putin down the line of reducing everything to Crimea or the Crimean Tatars, but recognize that what has happened in Crimea is a single most serious threat to the international community, perhaps since 1918. Many people have observed that what Vladimir Putin has done with the Anschluss of Crimea is to begin the process of revising the 1991 settlement, which led to the restoration of independence for the 3 Baltic countries and 12 new states, including the Russian Federation. The 1991 settlement was something that worked to the benefit of many people, even worked to the benefit of many Russians, although it was an incomplete settlement largely because the United States in 1992, for its own reasons, decided that 1991 was as far as anything could go. We have delayed the process of the further collapse of the Russian Empire. We have not ended it. And the one thing that Vladimir Putin has done for me, I have leukemia, is to assure me that I will be able to visit places now occupied by the Russian Federation that will have independent states within enough years that someone like me will get to visit them. I come at this issue and insist on the broader implications because I live in retirement in the Shenandoah Valley, and on the local country and western radio station which I listened to the day before yesterday, one of the hosts said, word is that the Russians are going to invade Ukraine from another place called Transnistria. And he said, and we will give you more details when we can find it on a map. There is a tendency not to pay attention to these things, and America's ignorance of geography is one of the greatest problems. But it is not simply with the occupation of Crimea and the Anschluss, which Mr. Putin has sponsored, represents a revision of 1991. Far more seriously, what Mr. Putin has done reflects a revision of the settlement of 1945. Because the settlement of 1945, which resulted in the creation of the United Nations, was predicated on the notion that citizenship must be more important than ethnicity, and that ethnicity must not be used to subvert citizenship. That's what the UN Charter is about. That's what any number of concerns about the treatment of ethnic minorities. Mr. Putin, by insisting that he has a right to send military force to defend people who happen to speak Russian or who claim some genetic relationship to the Russian nation, or whom he can claim as having some genetic relationship to the Russian nation, thus represents a direct challenge to the settlement of 1945. But there is a third challenge that Crimea represents, and that is a challenge to the settlement of 1918. Increasingly, we are hearing in Moscow of people who say, as Vyshinsky said in 1939 and 40, that the age of small countries is over, and it is time to go back to the big countries, to an imperial arrangement. The defense of empire by Alexander Dugin and other people in Moscow is truly frightening, because it suggests a retreat from the things that, on all three grounds, the three things that defined what we hoped the world would be in the 21st century. What I'd like to do, very quickly, since I'm speaking first, is to do three things, as is my wont. I'm a Trinitarian, and then make three conclusions about how we ought to respond. First, I'd like to talk about the sources of Mr. Putin's actions and what's likely to come next, and why many of the things that are assumed on the basis of Western interaction with him are simply not true. Second, I'd like to look at what I see as the West's failure to understand what's going on and to try to counter it. I find it deeply offensive that we are already speaking of Crimea as part of Ukraine in the past tense, and that we are putting it on maps that way. At least, when Stalin occupied the Baltic countries, we put a notice that we did not recognize that occupation. Now we're already making the shift very, very quickly. And third, I want to look at the consequences of the interplay of Putin's activism and the West's failure. Because the consequences of both are going to have enormous impact on our own country, and they are going to have an even larger impact on the country that Mr. Putin claims to rule. There is good news, and that is that what is happening to the Crimean Tatars is going to make sure that the Russian Federation is going to come apart, and come apart much faster, but unfortunately in a much more ugly fashion than anyone is now thinking about. Yes, people get a charge out of republishing maps produced by the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry of how you could divide up the Russian Federation. Let me suggest to you there are very real maps, and these maps are being prepared by the peoples of the region, not by foreign ministries of other countries. And finally, then, there are three things that I care very much about saying as someone who lives 150 miles from Washington, but when I do come here, I want to make sure I say them. Okay. With regard to Mr. Putin, The most important thing to understand about Putin's move into Crimea is that it was not generated by anything on the ground in Crimea. If you had looked at events 2 months ago, you would see that Crimea was not on anybody's radar screen. Indeed, a number of Russians have been honest enough to point out that when we think about Ukraine, the only place we care about is Kiev, not Crimea. Nobody was focused on Crimea. There was no wellspring, there was no set of problems that justified it. This was a manufactured crisis. And it was manufactured by Vladimir Putin and his political technologists for 3 reasons. The first is that it reflects the personality type that Vladimir Putin, as a not-so-former KGB officer, represents. As the great Soviet naval captain Nikitin said, there are no ex-KGB officers, just as there are no ex-German shepherds. Vladimir Putin is still part of the world that he came out of, and he sees the world surrounded, his country surrounded by enemies, and the question is, how do you take advantage of it? A lot of what Putin is doing reflects a deep-seated personality problem that is not going to be solved by wishing it away. And it is nonsensical to continue to read in the American press that there was a problem in Crimea that our hero, Vladimir Vladimirovich, was addressing. There was no problem in Crimea. The problem was manufactured because it reflected a personality. Why not? The second element is a personal decision by Putin. The fact is the Russian Federation is in deep trouble. My favorite thing that's been on Facebook in the last 2 weeks is Vladimir Putin's response to the price of oil. At $100 a barrel, he says, it's all ours. At $60 a barrel, he says, maybe we can share. And at $30 a barrel, he says, how do I learn Ukrainian? The fact is that what we are talking about is a situation where Putin is in, his country's economy is in trouble, he is under challenge, and despite his poll numbers, they are very, very thin. Yes, everybody's in favor of him just now. Let me suggest to you, if you look beyond those poll numbers, you will discover that he doesn't have the kind of support, and his country is in deep trouble. I keep track of a lot of the regional press, and what I see are a division in the country between ethnic Russian areas that are saying, why are we spending money on the Olympics in Crimea rather than opening hospitals and making sure that my family has insulin? And what they are saying, if they are in the non-Russian parts of the country, is, why is Mr. Putin so concerned about federalism abroad? He doesn't have any at home. His federalism is only for exporting. There is none in the Russian Federation, and we want some. And the third reason for Putin's action right is, so what he is doing, a good little war is always an occasion for repression at home and justifying it. And what we are seeing is Mr. Putin using a good little war to justify greater repression at home. And third, Mr. Putin has, I'm afraid, far too accurately understood that he is in a world where the West is not going to stand up to him and where he can play divide and conquer politics between the Europeans and the Americans, which I would remind you has been Soviet and Russian policy since 1945, if not earlier. The second point I would make is that Mr. Putin, and apparently Sergei Lavrov, as Mr. Putin's mouthpiece, are constantly stressing that we only want to focus on Crimea. That's the wrong thing. I'm old enough to have grown up in the darkest Midwest, and one of the things you did when you were in the darkest Midwest is you went to Stuckey's restaurants on the roadside when you were traveling. And there were always these paper placemats which had dots on them. And you were told to connect all these dots with only 3 lines. The only way you could connect those dots is if you took the line outside the perimeter of the dots. The mistake that's being made here and being encouraged by Vladimir Putin is not to go beyond those things, to accept it as a discrete problem. The problem is that Mr. Putin's motivations do not stop at Crimea and will be visited on other places because he thinks he can do it. And that includes Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, whether they're in NATO or not. The third point I would make is I would call what we are seeing now as the phony war. This is the period between October 1939 and the spring of 1940, when Hitler stopped attacking and when people in London of a certain kind, including members of the Communist Party, of course, were urging the fact that nobody needs to stand up to this man because he's no longer a threat. Yes, he took Poland, and yes, it's too bad about the Poles, but there's nothing to be done. That's exactly the wrong thing. It was wrong then, it's wrong now. Okay. Second, the West has totally failed, it seems to me, in three respects. The first is that the West, even though it won, quote unquote, won the Cold War, was not willing to focus on just what the Soviet system was about. It assumed that if people renamed themselves and re-identified themselves, that they had changed. Why? Why should we assume that? We've seen people rename themselves, but that doesn't mean that their impulses are not the same. I teach ethnic conflict, and one of the things I insist upon is that if you're going to talk about other people's ethnicity, you had best understand your own. And one of the basic core American values of our culture, of our ethnic culture broadly understood, is that we believe that all problems have solutions, and we increasingly believe that those problems need to have solutions before the second commercial. And if they don't, they're not problems anymore. The consequence of that is that we were unwilling to focus on just how evil the Soviet system was, because had we said how evil it was, we would have had to do something about it. So it was much easier to deny the nature of its evil, the constructed identities, the xenophobic attitudes that were widespread. The second part of it, that's underlying a whole lot of things. The second part of the West failure is that we have betrayed the countries between ourselves and Moscow, and the peoples between ourselves and Moscow. I was quite active years ago in the Baltic cause, and I know that in Eastern Europe, and certainly in the Baltic states, the mantra always was, nothing about us without us. Do not make deals over our heads. The way in which the United States has chosen to negotiate about Ukraine without the presence of Ukraine is an obscenity, and is a reminder to the entire area that they can no longer take the United States seriously. That has consequences. If you're going to talk about Ukraine or about the Crimean Tatars, they need to be at the table. And we haven't insisted on that, and we're going to pay for it. And the third is, we have fallen completely for Putin's notion that this is only about Crimea or only about Ukraine. I believe that Mr. Putin has a much bigger agenda than that, because he is driven by much bigger factors. Crimea isn't the driving factor. What the Russians need or want in Ukraine is Kyiv. Either because of the lie about 988, which is just that, or the lie that Crimea was always ours, which of course is also not true, and that in fact, the joke that people make about they want Alaska back and now they want Northern California too, the fact is this is a country that doesn't know who it is because no one's ever insisted that they do. And that is a huge problem. I believe that what we are seeing in the midst of is that Vladimir Putin is going to try to break NATO by doing something in the Baltic countries, in Latvia in the first instance. That's a very, very scary thing. Because if he succeeds, then all the guarantees go away. But since we've already thrown the agreement of '93 out the window with respect to Ukraine, who's going to believe us anyway? Now the consequences of this are multiple, but I want to point to three. The first is, we have seen an unbelievable decline in the last several years of the thing we enjoyed the greatest comparative advantage in, our soft power. Our influence as a source of education, of a source of values, and we have allowed others, in this case the Russian Federation, to show that hard power really works. In 1991, Americans bought into the nonsense that we were at the end of history. that everybody was basically the same. Then came September 11th, and the Americans had to decide that, well, everybody's basically the same if they're organized as a government, but there's some sub-state actors that are bad, but we can all agree as states. Now, maybe, we are finding the third, or the second 9/11 is a wake-up call that there are states in the world that are prepared to use hard power because it works. And if people draw that conclusion, there will be more of it, and not just around the periphery of the thing called the Russian Federation. Second, as has been mentioned in the introductory comments, if Putin stopped right now, the government that would emerge in Ukraine is going to be more anti-Russian and more unified as a Ukrainian state than any in history. Somebody once said that Ukrainians should issue a statue, or put up a statue of Joseph Stalin because he was the greatest state builder in Ukrainian history. He added more territory to that people than anyone else. Maybe right next to him, or perhaps being held in his arms, is Vladimir Putin, who would be the greatest nation builder in Ukrainian history because he has made Ukrainians united in a way they never were before. There will not be a Ukrainian state that will not be anti-Russian from now on. So it'll either be occupied or it will be anti-Russian. If that's so, one of the great dangers which I've seen all my life is a propensity of people in this country to dismiss the countries in between Russia and Western Europe as somehow not worthy of our attention or support. I got into this business because somebody I had in graduate school dismissed the entire Belarusian nation as, quote, having the qualities you would expect in any other, quote, backward peasant anti-Semitic people. There are far too many people in this country who will then be prepared to sacrifice the Ukrainians precisely for reflecting some of their national values, because we can count on the way some of those will be manifested. And so we will have more anti-Russian attitudes in the periphery, and we will have more Russian sponsorship of people on the other side, and we will have more conflicts. And it will not be limited to Crimea, and it will not be limited to Ukraine. I do believe that Putin has an agenda to take all of southern Ukraine all the way to Transnistria, even if the people of the rock country in western station can't pronounce it, and to do it relatively soon. I also believe there will be a phony war for a period thereafter, so that people here will come to believe that, well, we have so many things we can cooperate with Mr. Putin on. The third consequence, however, is the one that gives me greater optimism. What is striking and is not being picked up is that what is happening in Crimea is serving as a stimulus for thinking in a majority, if not in all, of the non-Russian republics inside the Russian Federation. You see everyone talking about what federalism means and what our power should be. You see people talking about, we will go to court. My God, even the Chukchis have gone into court. They've gone into court because they don't like the dictionary definition, racist dictionary definition that the Great Russian Dictionary of the Russian Language provides. But the Komi have gone into court to block Lukoil from pumping oil and gas on their territory. And you are seeing Chuvashia and Buryatia, not just in the North Caucasus, in the Middle Volga, a wellspring of attitudes. What happens? Not surprisingly, you then see a countervailing Russian nationalist approach. And I want to bring that back to Crimea. One of the things that people have to understand is that Vladimir Putin is not completely free to choose how he will treat the Crimean Tatars. He couldn't treat them well if he wanted to, whatever lies he tells. Because if Mr. Putin were to really give Crimean Tatars what they wanted, an autonomous republic which they were running the show, he would lose face with the local ethnic Russian majority, which he's made other promises to, and he would lose face with Russian nationalists and the Russian Federation writ large. And those consequences are things that are more important to him than treating the Crimean Tatars well. People in Washington and the United States who are naive enough to think that, well, Putin will solve this by treating the Crimean Tatars right. I put it to you, he doesn't have that option, and that's a really scary situation. I believe that Mr. Putin has shortened the life of the Russian Federation from a few decades, probably to a few years, and perhaps less than that. I think there are places, and I would say Buryatia and the Middle Volga, Ural, that are more likely to block what he wants to do than anything he can imagine. And I feel comfortable saying that because it's not nearly as odd to say that as it was to say that the Soviet Union was coming apart in early 1991. And I do remember what that was like. Nobody could imagine. We were so sure the Soviet Union wouldn't come apart that even when it did, we had people who wouldn't admit it. The last place the Soviet flag flew officially in the entire world, as some of you may know, was at the U.S. Department of State, where it was kept up 6 days after Putin took it down over the Kremlin, qualifying the denizens of that building for life membership in the Empire Loyalist League. Okay, now, what should we do? What should be done? 3 things, seems to me. First, we have to learn that one of the reasons we have the problem we have today is that our rhetoric and the actions that we take are so far apart and everybody knows it, which means that the words that we use have lost their influence. We have to decide whether we're going to tone down our rhetoric and accept actions by others that we don't like, or we're going to have to bring our actions up to where our rhetoric is. It does not help to appear to promise things that you're not going to deliver. It only encourages people to test you, and encourages people to test you in ways that at some point they may actually cross a red line that you're going to defend. Because there are such red lines that people will defend, and people are not thinking in those terms. There are things that we would not back before. So we have to begin to think seriously about what our rhetoric should be and what our action should be. I know where I am personally on these subjects, but I also know that that may not be where we are as a country, given our declining relative size of resources. I think every morning when I get up at 4 a.m., the first thing I think is, how will the Russians amuse me today? The second thing I think is the greatest description of American approach that was ever made. This was by Winston Churchill in 1944, who said that Americans can always be counted on to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. That was an honest statement of where we were in 1944 when the United States had half of the world's GDP. Now we have 20%. We cannot continue to afford to make mistakes of the kind we've been making, because we will not have the option to do 2 and the second and third and 15th chance, as we did in the past. And there is a contempt for expertise, a contempt for understanding the world. We aren't training people in languages. We don't have the expertise. I just wonder how many people we have in the government of the United States who speak Crimean Tatar. I don't know, but my guess is the number is not large. Not large. The second thing we have to understand, if we look at Crimea not as an isolated incident about a small country far away about which we know nothing or little, is that if it in fact reflects deeper trends and deeper problems with Mr. Putin and the Russian Federation, a tougher stance now is cheaper than the response will have to be if we don't take a tough stance. That eventually there will be challenges that we will have to meet. And those challenges could be very serious indeed. I do hope that the peoples who live on the territory of what is described as the Russian Federation will save us from ourselves, but we can't count on it all the time. And the third point, last point I want to make, is that the United States has always benefited, certainly in the last 100 years, because of its soft power, not so much its hard power. Soft power, our influence of our ideas, our principles, and the things that we have suggested for other people have always allowed us to get our way far more than the hard power that we focus on when we lose soft power. We need to revive our soft power. What does that mean? Well, I think that we need to understand, first and foremost, that the 3 settlements that the revisionist regime of Vladimir Putin is challenging were all our ideas. They all reflected our values, and we are the people who are being attacked, not just the Crimean Tatars. We should be allied with the Crimean Tatars because ultimately, in Vladimir Vladimirovich's universe, the Americans are the object of attack, not some small nationality. I regret to say that, but it's true. The second thing is to understand that we cannot probably afford to live in a world where hard power is the only thing out there. We have got a population, as I said to someone earlier this morning, that is far more concerned about the next NASCAR competition or the American Music Awards in Las Vegas this Sunday night and what TV channel they'll be on than we are about problems abroad. Americans, I like to say, are prisoners in the Mercator projection. You know what I mean. The map of the world that most of you carry in your heads has America in the middle as God intended, protected by two blue bodies of water and a large number of constant and vowel-challenged countries and edge ready to fall off. We are ignoring the risk. Third and last thing, which I beg us to do. As you may know, at the start of the Ukrainian Crimean crisis, it was announced that Washington plans to further cut back on its international broadcasting. This is exactly what not to do. International broadcasting is one of the most important things we can do, and we should begin by having a Crimean service right now, broadcasting in this area, and we should make it clear that we will expand our broadcasting to all the other peoples at risk of Vladimir Putin's vicious authoritarianism. That would be, in many ways, the best way to protest the revisionism of the three standards on which the world rests. It's cheap, therefore should be attractive to both sides of the aisle in this town. And it is something that we could all be very proud of. I would like to see it happen, and I don't think, unfortunately, there is an understanding yet of why we should be doing this rather than waiting until we have to do something where we will be at relative disadvantage.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. We'll go straight over to you. Paul has to leave at about 3, I think, so I don't know if there'll be time for questions for you, but you do.
Is this working?
Push the little switch on top there.
Okay. We all saw the unfolding of Crimean crisis in front of our eyes, almost in a fast-forwarded motion. And everybody seems to think that, including Paul, Putin has played a big role in this. And I agree, I don't disagree. But my point is today is to bring out some other things from within the Crimean political landscape for you to see that it was Putin, but also he got a lot of help from the inside. First of all, these events, the Crimean crisis, did not start in March or late February or anti-Maidan, after Maidan or something like that. It was happening since 1989. Before the Crimean Tatars were almost returning, the autonomy problem surfaced then in 1991. And in 1992, they passed this resolution that Crimea, this was in February, that Crimea is independent. Well, in 1991, it was still the Soviet Union, but 1992, they wanted to make sure that Crimea preserves that independence. Then in 1992 May, they added something else and suggested that now Crimea is within the Ukrainian framework. So this bothered a lot of pro-Russian groups there immediately. So since 1992, pro-Russian groups, including Congress of Russian Communities in Crimea, the Union of Orthodox Citizens of Crimea, Russian Bloc, Russian Community of Crimea, and Russian Unity. And Russian Unity, let me get your attention there. Guy Aksionov, Sergei Aksionov, who is now like the president of Crimea, he belongs to Russian Unity. Obviously, he was very young at that time, but now he belongs to Russian Unity. So these groups were persistently talking about another referendum. Maybe we can set a referendum and we can bring more independence to Crimea. But then they didn't want more independence for Crimea. They just wanted to reunify with Russia. So that came over and over and over again in the parliament. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. In the meantime, in Ukraine, on July 2004, for instance, Ukrainian President Kuchma vetoed the law on restoration of the rights of the persons deported on ethnic basis, and due to the alleged objections of the Ukrainian presidential administration. Now, again, we see that in 2004 and 2014, and people think it's a new thing that Petro Poroshenko, the Willy Wonka, you know, the chocolate factory, the chocolate king of Ukraine, his name is Petro Poroshenko, he brought this in Verkhovna Rada last week, brought this topic up, that draft resolution on the statement of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine to guarantee the rights of the Crimean Tatar people as part of the state of Ukraine. So some of you may ask, why is this happening now? I mean, Crimea is no longer Ukraine, so now Ukraine is passing the law. Good question, I don't know the answer. But the one answer is because Mustafa Dzhemilev is also in New York right now, and with the Ukrainian delegation, accompanied by Leonid Pulinsky and some other names from Kurultay Ruch, and also some people from the Yulia Tymoshenko's group of people. In fact, Yulia Tymoshenko wrote a letter to Mustafa Dzhemilev and Rifat Chibarov, and they were doing this change of posting in the Mejlis in Crimea a couple of months ago. So what's going on right now? Is Crimea Russia? Is it Ukraine? Why is Dzhemilev talking to Ukrainian people and the Security Council? And well, because Dzhemilev's view, and it was until yesterday, it was the whole Crimean Tatar view that Russians are occupiers, and we are not going to do any business with the Russian occupying people. These green men, little green men, might be polite and everything like that, but we don't like them. And also, especially after Reshat Ahmetov's death, we saw him on the video actually that two people grabbed him, and they all, and two had the Russian uniform and one didn't. So one was an internal guy. This is just the recent death, torturous death of one of the participants who protested against the referendum. So people might think, what's going on? Well, this is what's going on. Right now, there is a big split in Mejlis today. This happened today and yesterday. They had a major Kurultay, which is similar to a referendum among the Crimean Tatars. And some of the people who were so against, who were waving the Ukrainian flag in Maidan and working with Ukrainians very closely, now they changed sides. So carrots and sticks, I think for some, the carrots work. And now, some of these people, and the names, I mean, it's unbelievable, because one guy who sponsored the film Haydarma, which was about the Russian, about the Crimean Tatar pilot fighter, who is a hero, who received a 3 times Hero of Soviet Union award. He made a movie about this in May, and even the Russian ambassador was against this, and the people came from Russia to see this movie, and everybody was against this. There were huge protests, and this guy was in the middle of everything. And now this guy is going to be, he is given the vice presidency of Crimea. I mean, and he accepted it. Very many people from the Mejlis who were sitting next to Mustafa Dzhemilev yesterday, they are now going to the other side. So now things started getting a little bit complicated, because this never happened before. And what's going to happen next? It's a good guess for everybody. But one thing that I would like to agree with Paul. Paul said these people are not going to, even if Putin gives them everything, like that's not going to work out, because he's going to lose face. Not only that he's going to lose face, but also the people who are in the Crimean parliament right now. A couple of names: Sergei Shuvaynikov, who always wanted to reunify with Russia. This Aksyonov, who belongs to Russian Unity, but also some of you who speak Russian, they probably read, they call him Goblin. The reason for this is because he's a member of Seylan Voronov, which is a mafia group, one of the well-known mafia groups in Crimea. Alexander Melnik, very well-known Crimean parliamentarian, he also belongs to this group. And between this group and the Bashmaki, which is another mafia group, these are at least 40 of these people are in the Crimean parliament right now. So Crimean parliament is 100 people, and that's different than the Ukrainian parliament. Ukrainian parliament has 450, Crimean parliament has 100. Right now 99, because one is in, that guy is in jail because of the mafia connections, so there are 99 people right now. And these people are not going to work with the Crimean Tatars because these are the people for the, yes, Crimea wasn't on the agenda for so many people in DC. I personally am going to Crimea every year since 2001, so it was in my agenda. And I kept coming with all sorts of information. How many mosques were being burned down? How many cemeteries were being desecrated? They were drawing swastikas on Crimean Tatar cemeteries, and now recently we see that also in Crimean Tatar lands in Bachasaraya especially. But this is not new, because you see it now, it doesn't mean that it wasn't happening for the last 20 years. The last 20 years this was happening because of the people who are inside. And these people were waiting any opportunity that Putin can lend a hand to them. And when the Maidan events happened in Kiev, it was the big moment, and this is the packed up mentality of the insiders as well as Putin joined together in force, and boom, Crimea is now Russia. What does it mean for Crimean Tatar people? Well, Crimean Tatar people that I speak with every day are very feared of their lives. 350 Crimean people already left. Some, I think 40 left for Poland, 350 left for Lviv, it's a Ukrainian city, and so far, but most of the other people are staying, and they don't know what's going to happen. I see old people crying and fearing for their lives, but at the same time, today, 150 people protested in front of Mejlis, because now they found out that Mejlis people are going to be collaborating, some of the Mejlis people are going to be collaborating with these inside forces, the mafiosos, so to speak. So where does it take us? Well, there are 150,000 Crimean Tatars in Uzbekistan and other places of exile right now. And they wanted to come to Crimea, but because of the financial situation, they weren't able to. So now, Ukraine is actually passing another law, again, too little, too late, but it's happening right now. That's going to guarantee all the restoration and the financial everything for Crimean Tatars. And also, what they are discussing in the Ukrainian parliament today and also in the United Nations Security Council today is the point of indigenousness. If Crimean Tatars are recognized as the indigenous people of Ukraine, then they will have a lot of power in their hands, including the self-determination. So let's say that that happened, let's take that scenario. Russians are now kind of self-determined, I mean Russians, Crimean Russians, I mean, and then Crimean Tatars are going to declare their self-determination. That's like the movie says, there will be blood. So we don't want that, of course. So now, as Paul was suggesting, what does others do? Well, obviously, regardless of the agreement, 1992 agreement, and also 1994 agreement, that Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons, and America, Russia, and Great Britain were like, okay, we will protect Ukrainian territorial integrity. So now Crimea is gone. What's going to happen? Well, next time, if they go in other places of Ukraine, I don't think Putin is planning to go to anywhere. This is my opinion, might be wrong. But I don't think he's just scaring, because that's what he can do. He looked at it and he can get away with it. But Crimea was the point, because Crimea is where the Black Sea Fleet is. Crimea is, when Catherine the Great, Catherine II, annexed Crimea to the Russian Empire in 1783 the first time, she said Crimea without Crimean Tatars. And that's a mantra, and always was, like he was saying. And then 1944, again, Crimea was Crimean Tatars deportation. This is why Crimean Tatars always supported and investigated everything they have within the Ukrainian government, because they felt like Ukraine is the only government that welcomed them actually in 89, 1991. Although they had lots of problems within Ukraine too, like, the land issues that I don't want to go into. There is no land reform, this and that, but still, they felt like if anything happens, and God forbid, if Crimea is annexed by Russia, then it's going to be our end. They're going to come and kill us. This time we are only 300 people, whereas the 2 million people are are the others, so it's going to be difficult. And this became in such a way that, for instance, there is a Ukrainian Orthodox Church and there is a Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate and also Kiev Patriarchate. We have Crimean Tatars even helped the although they are Muslims and they are not Christians, they helped the Kiev Patriarchate person when he came to Simferopol. Pro-Russian group circled the airport and they just wanted to kidnap him or kill him or something like that. So Crimean Tatars were helping the Ukrainians to get him to Kherson and back. This much collaboration with Ukraine, and in return, they didn't receive much, but they always supported Ukrainian territorial integrity. So now I don't know where is the situation going, because some of them are collaborating, like I said, with the Russian and pro-Russian forces, which is not going to work out, because even if they wanted to do everything and Putin gives them gold medals, the Russians in Crimea are not going to work with the Crimean Tatars. So that's one issue. But the other issue, there must be something that we don't know, because Gemilev is trying so hard to talk with the Ukrainians right now and with the Security Council and everything. Maybe there is an opportunity for Crimea to return to Ukraine eventually. But if Putin wants to get into other places of Ukraine, that's going to be after the 25th of May. Because Putin likes witnesses, and I think he's looking who is going to be the next president of Ukraine. There still might be some of his people around there, because like, for instance, Rinat Akhmatov, also well-known mafia from the Donbass, I heard that he was given a position in those areas, for instance. If that goes through, I don't think he's going to occupy anything in Donetsk, Donbass region. But if it doesn't go through, that might be it. Crimea, Crimean Tatars will never let it go. They want their self-determination there. They lived there for 300 years when the Crimean Khanate was in power. Some of the Sanjaks, they called it, their port cities were under the Ottoman Empire, but still Crimean Tatars were able to mint their own coins and had their own wars and things like that. Then, they had their indigenous, was recognized during the Lenin era, and now they are still waiting for this to happen. They suffered a lot, so they're not going to give up, and the pro-Russians are not going to give up either, because they also call Crimea Rodina, although 90% of them came to Crimea after the deportation of Crimean Tatars. So we really have, and when Glenn and I talked last year, he said Flashpoint, and I'm like, no, I disagree. But now I say, yes, there is a Flashpoint, and now actually it's a conundrum of Crimea. So that's all I have to say.
Okay. Thank you very much, Idil. Straight over to Pavel Vildea-Rodrienta.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts. And I have to admit that I don't have that many thoughts. I will try to be very short, because there is a question as the title of my presentation: will Russia invade eastern Ukraine? And my answer is very simple: it cannot, and it probably will.
Very good.
And the shortest possible explanation to the first part is that it doesn't have the military muscle. That's why it cannot. And the explanation to the second part is that the moment it stops moving, it starts losing. And that is a fact of political life. And now I can go into details about the military muscle, how exactly weak Russia is, because very often it is portrayed as this kind of colossal military superpower, which can do just about anything, which can roll over Ukraine at will. It's not really the case. And when you think about, okay, 30,000 Russian troops are amassing on Ukraine border, 30,000 looks like a tall number, maybe it's 40. Ukrainians sometimes saying it's 100,000 people, the troops amassing, which is probably way beyond. But let me remind you, it took 100,000 people to subdue Chechnya. And Chechnya is far smaller than eastern Ukraine. And we are not even saying about the quality of these thousands, because yes, Russian military reform achieved some success. There was a modicum of success, and that it's possible to go into the details what exactly was done, was not done. But the priorities there always was strategic nuclear forces. And it's a priority in the rearmament program as well. And these forces are not really very relevant in this conflict. You need to look into your battalions, and the battalions are not neither big enough nor good enough to do the job. You know, Eastern Ukraine is just too big for that. Kharkiv is a city of 1.5 million, and Donetsk is a city of about 1 million. And you bring your small battalions there, they just disappear. And we're going to look at what is really going to be amassing there. The day before, Putin told Merkel, after calling her, that he's withdrawing the troops, and indeed 1 battalion was probably moved. 1 battalion. What is good for essentially there? For very little. So it is possible to continue this line of argument, but more importantly is to look what really drives Putin to do this thing, which is so, in many ways, a mission impossible. And here I do agree with most what Paul said, and that I don't want to elaborate on that, that the Crimea was never really a goal. Putin never dreamed about capturing Crimea. He's not sentimentally attached to this piece of land. It was just an opportunity that came and was grabbed. It was a means to an end. And the end was probably twofold. From the very beginning, it was the big Eurasian project, Phantasm probably, which Janusz said from the very beginning, which was there kind of in the forefront when Ukraine tried to move ahead with signing the association agreement with the EU. That was kind of the key proposition there, why you cannot be allowed to do that. And the second point, second big aim of the whole policy was the revolution. This kind of specter of revolution, which Putin's side finds very frightening indeed, which he kind of sees as a kind of colossal tide of events going from Tbilisi to Kiev, then to the Arab world, and now to Kiev again, which has to be stopped. And it's only him, Vladimir Putin, who can stop that and turn the tide back. And these two goals are essentially compatible. The Eurasian project was supposed to unite the authoritarians and dictators of various persuasions, who are all indeed very much against this tide of revolutions, who are threatened by that, and Putin sees himself as a natural leader to that. Very good. And then Crimea. Does it fit into the Eurasian project? Not really, not at all. This whole discourse about kind of ethnic Russians and defense of compatriots is very worrisome for Kazakhstan, for that matter, who abstained from voting in the United Nations. It doesn't really fit into any imperial discourse, because that discourse is not ethnic by its very nature. The great damage done by the Crimea to the Eurasian project. And what about the revolution? Well, you capture Crimea, and Ukraine is very strongly moved in the western direction. Ukraine feels threatened by Russia. It comes for aid to the West. Essentially, you are left with a situation when you win Crimea, lose Ukraine. Very bad bargain. And the revolution is essentially triumphant. So that is the situation Putin is finding himself in, and he's probably not yet discovered that simple truth, that he stops moving and starts losing. He thinks, I presume, he has gained himself a position of power, and now he can negotiate. That's why he's going to be sending Lavrov to Kerry, and I do have problems with those talks in Paris, truth be said, because Kerry said it correctly, that we will not negotiate about Ukraine without Ukraine, as you had said. But that's exactly what we did for 4.5 hours, which is generally not a good idea, but nothing could possibly come out of these negotiations. Honestly, whatever maneuvering you put there, because there are certain things which Putin thinks he can negotiate from this imaginary position of power, which in fact it isn't. The position is far weaker than he imagines on several dimensions. not only on the military dimension, and not only on the kind of Eurasian another dimension. It is far weaker in the economic dimension. Andrei Illarionov is here. He probably can offer you a better expertise than mine of how weak Russian economy really is. It is Russia in this sense is not the Soviet Union. It's not a self-sufficient economic system, and it's not it cannot even be compared with Germany, who was kind of doing the Anschluss on the drive of very strong economic performance. Russia's economic performance was quite weak before the Crimea, and Crimea is a big burden. And the investment climate has very seriously deteriorated, sanctions or not. So the economic trend is going very much against Putin. He's probably is going to discover that fact. The time is not on his side. Stops moving, starts losing, and the moment he discovers that, what he will do. My suspicion is that Eastern Ukraine will suffer, and it's again it is a very problematic proposition. And you can see that on all the previous track, Putin was very keen to keep the initiative, to move very fast. He was able to move much faster than anybody in the West could have imagined. He was not only playing white, he was playing kind of 3 steps ahead of anybody else on that chessboard. Initiative was his great advantage, being able to move fast. Now it is a pause. He discovers the problems. He needs to regain the initiative, essentially. He moves the initiative to regain. What happens? And it's a big question. And it's essentially the answer is with the Ukrainians. If they will not defend themselves, nobody else will. And you know, it's simple as that. And I cannot answer for the Ukrainians. I don't know enough about their will to resist. I know what happened in Chechnya at the very start of the First War. How the columns moved there, meeting no resistance at all, from 3 directions until they met in Grozny. And Grozny is the city of 100,000 people, and then the disaster struck. And the Maikop brigade was destroyed. It is very possible kind of to construct a situation of this sort in eastern Ukraine, which is very big, territorially very divided, and many of those kind of Russian speakers, even Russians living there, are not keen at all to be a part of the Russian Federation. What they want is kind of greater say in their own fate. They want to be able to have an influence on their lives, and that's not what they're going to have in the Russian Federation. And let me complete with one very problematic thought, and probably nobody here will agree with me. Yes, it depends upon the Ukrainians what will happen later, but it also very much depends upon the West. And Putin is counting on the fact that the stronger he strikes, the more disarray there is, the more dismay, the more disorganization, the more disunity in the West. And I hope he's wrong with that. And I hope that NATO will find resolve to do the right thing as far as Baltic states are concerned. And I hope the EU will overcome its bureaucratic stupor and find opportunities to do the right thing. And I also hope that President Obama will be up to the challenge. Yes, I know it's hoping against the hope. And nothing in his track record suggests that. But there is a point in the academic research that the previous track record is not necessarily a final proof of what's going to happen. You know, people change. And in many ways, it is his rendezvous with history. And we collectively cannot let him to chicken out.
Thank you, Pavel. Now over to Steve.
Thank you, Janusz. Thank you, Janusz. Thank you, Glenn, for inviting me. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a Leninist task. I have to say what is to be done. I welcome it. But in order for us to understand what must be done, we must understand where we are in order to understand strategically what must be done, not just by the United States, but in the military sphere by the United States and NATO, and in non-military spheres by the United States and the European Union. both together and individually in their various roles. So there are certain points that must be emphasized from the beginning. By any standard, the invasion, occupation, and annexation of Crimea are acts of aggression and war and must be acknowledged and recognized as such. Furthermore, we have to stop this nonsense about seeking for off-ramps. This is not I-495, this is the real world. And the only off-ramp that Putin now can take is essentially to throw in the towel, because he has burned his bridges, as Pavel said, by annexing Crimea. He is now like Richard III. He is so far gone in blood, literally, that sin shall pluck on sin. And the only way out for him is surrender or the collapse of the Russian Empire, which, as Paul has said, he has hastened. I believe that too. And this will be, I think, when it's all over, the second Crimean War. And it bears some resemblances to the first. And the consequences may well be the same. But a lot of the furniture will be destroyed as well, unless we do the right thing. The second point is that by taking this action, and this action was foreseeable. There are people in the audience who know I told you about it in October. They're shaking their heads. But I'm not the only one. Janusz warned about it. Ariel Cohen warned about it. Taras Kutsia warned about it. Mikhail Saakashvili warned Alexander Vershbow, Assistant Secretary of Defense, about it in 2009. You read WikiLeaks, our diplomats were writing about this years ago. Years ago, I wrote that Putin was planning an operation in Crimea. He admitted in 2012 that he planned the operation in Georgia with separatists from 2006. What was the reaction in this town? Yawn. Why? It was August. You know, everybody's on vacation at the beach. Who cares about Georgia? But we were warned. We had 7 to 10 days of warning, as they call it in intelligence circles, and we didn't know what to do with it. Thus, we are dealing here with a situation where we have to improve our game. Intelligence and policy failures of this sort not only bespeak this administration's incompetence, strategically speaking, but that of the last 20 years, because we have had more than one such episode. So the fundamental thing that we need to do is, one, clear our mind of cant, as Samuel Johnson would say, and understand what we're dealing with. Second, that we have to stop pretending that we can go about pretending we're number one and increasingly become ignorant of the real world. As Paul has said, and I will say in my paper that I'm presenting next week for the Army, if we continue to cut our intelligence, education, and research budgets, we're going to end up with people who are going to go around saying, well, Crimea has always been the Russians. Yeah. Read Fred Hyatt in the Washington Post yesterday. Yes. Now, so fundamentally, first of all, something we can do without provoking anybody and creating the anguished cries of the lambs that are being led to the slaughter, that we are bringing back the Cold War, is to improve our intelligence and refund our training and research for the entire elite. Because this is not just the White House, my friends. This is Congress. This is the Defense Department, both under Republicans and under Democrats. It is a bipartisan malady, and it can only be corrected in bipartisan fashion. Second, Mr. Putin has demonstrated his belief, and that of his entourage, that the only way their regime can be secure is by empire. And empire means war, because it entails, first of all, the diminished sovereignty of every state, not just of the former Soviet Union, but east of the Elbe. Read Putin's speech of March 18th to the Duma. It's a landmine under the sovereignty of every post-Soviet and post-Warsaw Pact state in Europe and in Asia. It is a threat to all of them and must be dealt with accordingly. Third, this war has shattered the illusion that peace in Europe is a given, or that peace preserves itself. We now know that that's nonsense. We should have realized it at least in 2008. We have to take appropriate steps that it doesn't happen again. Fourth, Russia has shown that it refuses, again, to play by any concept of integration into any kind of European normative or political order. And if Russian power cannot and will not be integrated and insists on empire, then it must be contained. And I use the word deliberately because I worship at the shrine, so to speak, of George Kennan's articles in 46-47. We are dealing with an imperial threat to the status quo in Europe that was established a generation ago. And if we don't respond properly, it is not only in Europe that we will feel the threats coming at us right and left from other actors as well as Russia. With that in mind, we must understand what it is that has to be done. The strategic object over the period of time necessary to bring back the status quo ante means that our strategic objective should be not just the containment of Russian power, but the foreclosing of the imperial option, as Paul suggested. Foreclosing the imperial option not only deters war in Europe and deters Russian aggrandizement, it also, as Kennan would have suggested, creates the tensions inside Russia that will force reform of that system. And that might avert a catastrophic collapse that could become violent and spill over the borders, because that's what Putin is bringing about, although he doesn't realize it. Second, beyond the foreclosure of the imperial option as a long-term strategy, the most immediate urgent task is the use of all the instruments of power, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, to strengthen the state of Ukraine and allow Ukraine to build an effective, strong, legitimate, viable, democratic state. Because, as we can all see now, the single greatest threat to Russian security, as Putin understands it, which means his security, is a democratic Ukraine. And by foreclosing the imperial option, we allow indigenous forces of liberalism and democracy in Russia to grow. Because unfortunately, as Adam Mullen pointed out 45 years ago in his biography of Lenin, I can even give you the page, empire in Russian history is the greatest obstacle to reform. And Russian liberalism, as we know, stops at the border with Ukraine. So what we have to do is prevent that border from being overrun. There should be no negotiation over Crimea, period. We're not, if Ukraine is to become a federal state, it has to become a federal state by its own decision. And by the way, the Ukrainian constitution forbids foreign troops in Ukraine. There's only one state before this that had foreign troops in Ukraine. It was Moscow, Russia, because of the agreement in 2010 to keep the Black Sea Fleet. So Ukraine, by its own laws, denied itself any substantial role in NATO, although it could nominally become a member. But now this, I believe, has to change. So what do we do? Economically, it's very clear. The sanctions that have been imposed up to date are useful. They're having an effect, as everybody's now begun to see. They're not enough. We need to mobilize public opinion to name and shame groups like Goldman Sachs, Siemens, the City of London, which would probably collapse if not for dirty Russian money, as John le Carré told us 5 or 6 years ago. If you happen to read fiction, and sometimes spy novels are better than academic literature in my business. As a matter of fact, they often are. Since Paul and I went to grad school together, we know whereof we speak. The point here is that Russian export of corruption, which as Khodorkovsky pointed out was Russia's main product, has to be stopped and named. We need economically as well to devise viable plans, which necessarily have to be long-term, to bring about alternatives to Russian gas and to oil. Oil is more important than gas, to Europe. Europe has the means, over time, to find alternative sources of gas and oil, or of energy in general, and to reduce its dependence on Russian energy, which is a threat to the sovereignty of Europe, as Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland, told Angela Merkel. And as the head of E&I just said the other day in an interview. And he ought to know, because he's been in bed with the Russians for the last few years. So, those are economic means. Beyond that, Russian banks should come under the same sanctions that we have applied with Iran. This means a collective effort, if it's going to work, but it needs to be done. And lastly, again, a non-violent economic response, one that we did in 1956, is to start a run on the ruble. That forced the British out of Suez, and it would force Russia to think hard about what it wants to achieve. Because already this economy is suffering, and there's no reason to relieve that suffering as long as it wants to play an imperial game in Europe. Informationally, Paul mentioned international broadcasting. I couldn't agree more. Our efforts here have been, like the response to Ukraine, anemic. We need not only to increase our spending on informational broadcasting abroad, we need to expose the networks of informational warfare that are being subsidized by Russian money in this town, in Paris, in London, in Berlin, and etc. And many of us know who they are. What's more, they know who they are, and they are busy trying to buy influence. I can attest to this from personal influence, because they tried to buy me once upon a time. We know what's going on here. The intelligence agencies in this town know pretty much what's going on, and we need to expose these groups and to expose the lie, as Václav Havel and Solzhenitsyn would say. So in information, we need to understand that Russia has been conducting systematic information warfare in Crimea and abroad against us. To give you an example, I just came back from the International Studies Association convention in Toronto. During my panel on Black Sea security, one British professor, his name will be omitted to protect the guilty, said that the reason that the Russians had invaded was because of the coup on February 21st, which I missed, and the fact that Ukraine was drawing closer to NATO. Now, since there was no coup, but rather a revolution, and Ukraine is in no way connected to NATO, this gives you an example of what people who should know better are saying. Now, diplomatically as well, as I said, no negotiations over Crimea. Russia must be told, if you want to negotiate a settlement, you negotiate with the government in Kiev, and you pledge that you're getting out of Crimea and returning it to Crimea. Otherwise, we really have nothing to talk about. And if you insist on holding on to Crimea, all these sanctions will be ratcheted up on you until you give in. So diplomatically, that's necessary. Diplomatically as well, we need to put countries like Georgia on the track to the EU. The agreement in November that they signed for association is good. We need also to encourage the EU and NATO and the United States to engage in conflict resolution in the Caucasus, for example, to accelerate the efforts to have the United States, not Russia, lead the negotiations to mediate the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, strengthen economic and democratic institutions in Georgia, Moldova, Azerbaijan, etc. Also develop, of course, Azeri energy interests to bypass Russia and capabilities. Diplomatically as well, it ought to be made clear to Ukraine that the $18 billion settlement that it got from the IMF, even if it's not enough to solve Ukraine's problems, is a down payment if Ukraine makes the necessary reforms. Again, as Pavel said, only Ukraine can defend Ukraine. But it ought to be clear to Ukraine that if Ukraine is willing to take the hard, and believe me, it's going to be hard, road towards reform, it will come out stronger. And at the end of the day, having reformed and having pledged to accept the European Union's acquis communautaire, that the European Union will take it in as a member. Very good. It may take 15 to 20 years. One should not be naive about this, but it must be done. And the will to do it, I suspect, is now there in Kiev because everybody understands what the alternative is, both economically and politically. This brings me to the military case. First thing we should do here, the budget that was submitted by Secretary Hagel should be thrown out. A new one should be brought in with not only increased spending, but revised levels. We now know that war in Europe is possible, and we need ground and air and naval forces, as well as perhaps armored capabilities. I'm not going to get into numbers, that's for people who know more about this. But we need those capabilities deployed in Europe and on the front lines. They are there for two cardinal purposes, the cardinal purposes for which U.S. military power in Europe has been there since 1945, to deter and to reassure, not to start a war. But beyond that, we cannot take on good faith Russia's pledge of future guarantees, because of what value are Russian guarantees given the number of treaties they broke here? And it's not just treaties with the Budapest Memorandum, it's the Tashkent Treaty of the CIS, the 1997 agreement with Ukraine, the 1992 agreement, the 2010 agreement, and of course the NATO Founding Act and the NATO-Ukraine Act, which we failed to live up to as well. Since Russia has broken these treaties, I would scrap the NATO Founding Act with Russia and put permanent deployments in the Balkans of NATO, not just US forces, NATO, Balkans, Baltic, and states in Poland. I would keep permanent fleet deployments in the Black and Baltic seas. I would deploy the forces in land and ground and land and air defense forces, as well as missile defense forces in Poland, and give those air and ground forces offensive strike capability, so that Mr. Putin realizes that if he does start a war, because his system is now, as we can see, and as Andrei Ilarionov and I have written, prone to war because of its fundamental nature, that he'll lose. If we are going to make it clear to Mr. Putin that he is not winning, but in fact that he's losing and that he's going to lose more the longer this goes on, we have to take these credible steps of deterrence to do so. And that would also include not only war games in Ukraine, but the training of Ukrainian, Georgian, Azeri, and other forces in territorial defense, in intensified war games and transfer of armed military equipment and know-how to them. And I would also give them a course of action that they need to take if they want to become members of NATO. Now, Mr. Putin and his gang will tell you that NATO enlargement is the greatest threat to Russia and so forth. That's nonsense. The most secure frontier today in Russia is the western frontier, because everybody knows NATO is not going to attack anybody, and frankly couldn't if it wanted to before this crisis. That's going to change. But NATO's fundamental nature is not going to change. NATO is not an offensive operation. And we know it, and we have to get that message out over and over again, so that Mr. Putin cannot use wars for diversionary purposes at home, and that his media will not have an uncontested sway over the Russian mind. These are only some of the actions that need to be taken. There's a lot of literature now coming out as to what can be done. But in the time I had, I wanted to answer the Leninist responsibility of saying what is to be done. And the last point here needs to be understood. Ukraine has to take the lead in defending itself, but the United States, NATO, and the European Union must provide the valuable resources and assistance and leadership that we can do. Because this is no longer just a question of Ukraine or even just of European security, it is international security as a whole. And therefore, if we follow this course of action, starting with Ukraine, Washington, Brussels, for both organizations and the individual European states, Ukraine, Europe, and the United States will have not only saved Europe by their exertions, but world peace by their example. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Steve. Paul Gober has to leave in a few minutes, about 5 minutes. So if you have any questions or comments specifically to Paul, I'll ask you to address them. Please state your name and your affiliation.
Actually, I have a question, two questions to all panel, including Paul. Okay, my name is Andrei Ilarionov, Cato Institute. Two questions. We, seems to me, have a very clear understanding what does it mean Russia's guarantees for territorial integrity, and we don't need to waste time to discuss it. But could I ask the honorable panel to explain what does it mean US guarantee to territorial integrity in general, and in case of Ukraine, especially in view of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, what exactly the way how US is going or is not going to some kind of to safeguard territorial integrity of Ukraine? This is the first question. And second, with all proposals that have been put forward here and elsewhere about what to do in this particular case, could you please give us your suggestions how to force Mr. Putin or Russia to withdraw troops from Crimea? Just don't tell that economic sanctions or expulsion from G8 would produce the desirable job.
Okay, since I'm leaving first, I'll speak first. With respect to territorial integrity, American law, in its modern form, traces itself back to the Stimson Doctrine of 1930, where the United States said it would not recognize the manufactured state of Manchukuo created by Japan when it occupied Manchuria. That doctrine remains in force, and it was the basis for American non-recognition policy of the Soviet occupation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania a policy that remained in place from 1940 until 1991, and which in fact continues to be the legal basis for much of the state legislation and constitutions of the three countries. We have, with respect to the countries that succeeded from with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, on February 6, 1992, the United States declared in a statement, which is one of the reasons I'm living in Stanton rather than Washington, we declared that we would not recognize, quote, any secession from secession in the post-Soviet states, a statement that was greeted by some in the city as a guarantee that that the Russian Federation would not become a Yugoslavia with nukes, to quote the Secretary of State at the time. The idea was that the borders that Stalin had drawn had to be permanent borders forever and ever, which was because there was no willingness to explore the fact that most of the borders in the former Soviet space had been drawn to create tension rather than to resolve them, and that they were changed dozens of times. In fact, they were changed over 200 times between 1921 and 1981 in significant area to be recorded in the central legal documents of the USSR. So the idea was, as of February 6, 1992, that the United States had declared that we would be permanent guarantors of Stalin's borders as they existed in 1991. That remains the basic statement. Our position with respect to territorial integrity varies all over the place. We have sometimes respected it and sometimes not. If you're looking for a universal principle, I don't think it exists in American law or an American principle. But it is, with respect to the former Soviet states, it is very clear. You can go back to the February 6th statement. It came from the White House, not from the State Department. With respect to the second question about force, the most important thing that we have to do is to recognize that we probably can't do anything that would make Vladimir Putin withdraw from Crimea in the next week, month, or perhaps even year. One of the things that is important, and which I tried to say about my little joke about Americans believe all problems have solutions and that the problem should be available before the second commercial, is that sometimes you have to declare a position and keep it for a very long time, even if it doesn't look like it's going to work. I am absolutely convinced that America's non-recognition policy with respect to the Soviet occupation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania was the right thing to do and ultimately led to the restoration of their independence and the withdrawal of Soviet Russian forces from a lot of other places. I would like to see a statement of non-recognition of the Russian annexation of Crimea. I would like to see it become a matter of law, that no U.S. government-produced map will have show the Crimea as part of the Russian Federation, but should be shown it under provisional Russian occupation, not recognized by the government of the United States. I would like to see it become a matter of law that we do not recognize Russia's view of what its borders are. We recognize the borders that we recognized at the end of 1991. Is that going to force something very quickly? Probably not. Will it have a long-term consequence? Yes, it will have two. The first is it will contribute to what I believe is the most important thing we need to worry about, and that is the restoration of American influence by showing our commitment to certain principles which are available to everyone. And second, it will send a signal that even though we may be willing to do business on occasion with the thugs in the Kremlin, that we are not going to recognize actions like this. This is an occupation. It is an occupation that is exactly equivalent of Stalin's move into Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in 1940, manipulated the same way. And if you read the Baltic press, as I do fairly regularly, you will see that all three republics have featured articles in the last 2 months showing that they must have read the textbook about our country when they were preparing to occupy Crimea, because they've done it in exactly the same way. I think that there's time for now for declaring a new non-recognition policy, and that would include, because it's important to understand what non-recognition policy, what it would in this particular case. No American official, defined as senior, meaning confirmed by the Senate, should ever visit Crimea while it remains under Russian occupation. No, that people who come from there who want to declare themselves still retaining Ukrainian passports, that those passports will be recognized by the United States. If you do things like that, you may not get what you want. Of course, I would love to see Mr. Putin leave Crimea. In fact, I think I would like to see him leave a lot of other things too. As someone said, nothing behooved him so well as when he left a certain mortality. But having said that, I think we can do no less than declare a new non-recognition policy and make it a matter of law on American maps. I think it is unforgivable that maps are already being produced in this country that show this as part of the Russian Federation. That's wrong. And let's at least do... Jamestown, the great memoirist, wrote somewhere that happy is that country in which the despicable will at least be despised. Let's be a little bit happy and declare non-recognition policy about Putin's Anschluss of Crimea. I apologize for having to leave, but thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Stimulating as usual. See you next time. Safe trip. Pablo?
Yes, Andrei, I think it is a very important question, your second one. It is very easy to say, this is unacceptable. And then you come to the second question, what will it take to undo it? And here you can probably find an explanation of why Putin was in such a rush to incorporate the Crimea, why it was done rapidly, and that is done. He's establishing for fact the situation where it can be undone only by complete collapse of the Russian state. And that moves the whole problem to the category of unacceptable risk, avoided at any cost. And that's why you have so many now politicians saying, well, annexation of Crimea is already a fact of life. Very little can be done about that. We need to think now about Eastern Ukraine, you know, because collapse of the Russian state is not a hypothetical probability. We have seen Soviet Union far stronger state collapse. That collapse was remarkably peaceful. Nobody can guarantee that Russian collapse would be as peaceful. Risks are indeed unacceptable. And so that creates a very hard dilemma.
Steve?
Yes, I gave my recommendations. The point is that they have to be done together, concurrently, with a strategic objective in mind, and overtly intended to get this message across, that the occupation and annexation of Crimea will not stand, and that if you want to do business with us on a different basis, you're going to have to move back. As far as the question of guarantees, the Budapest Memorandum, which is the document in question, does not guarantee Ukraine's borders, as it's understood as a matter of law. It gives assurances that the United States and Great Britain, the other two signatories as well as Russia, will observe and protect the integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, but it does not commit the United States, formally speaking, to any particular course of action. In this sense, it's unlike Article 5, and we know that Russia understands the distinction quite well. And one more point that needs to be understood here, if you look at the nature of the operation from a professional military point of view, this was what we might call a coup de main. It was not a conventional or classic military operation. It was an attempt to get this done quickly by extraordinarily well-trained, disciplined men who've been rehearsing this operation for years, and do it quickly, non-violently, and prevent any resistance, because if there were resistance and a prolonged or a protracted war, that would bog the Russian military down in something it is not willing or prepared to deal with, and it could well have brought in NATO. So we need to understand that. But therefore, we need to also understand now that Article 4 and Article 5 of the Washington Treaty for NATO need to be reconceived and understood in the light of the changing character of contemporary war.
Thanks, Steve. Let's open up to other questions, comments. Lady over here, please, and then you.
Hi, Olena Drago, Global Education Leadership. Do you agree that Vladimir Putin makes his calculation to invade territories in Georgia, in Ukraine, based on the fact that he thinks that the West will play along with him because the West has the same interest. Putin's interest is to preserve his power, to preserve himself in Russia. And West, as you yourself right now referred, is also interested in having this strong Russia, having Putin in charge, because otherwise, if Russia disintegrates, we have Yugoslavia with nukes, as you said. So, because of this same interest, West allows Putin to do what he's doing. Do you agree with that or not? Thank you.
Steve?
No, I don't agree with that. Yugoslavia with nukes was James Baker's quote, not mine. And I don't. There may be people in the West who agree with that, but that's certainly not the policy of the government. The calculation, I think, by Putin, to the extent that we can read his mind, is that the West in general is in decline, weak, corrupt, divided, and unable to fashion a coherent response, even though it is a serious and everlasting threat. It's a uniquely Russian KGB conspiratorial kind of mentality, which if you study this thing long enough, which I have, you get to understand. But I'll give you an example. If you read the latest issue of the National Interest, the published version, as well as online, it's an article by Graham Allison from Sochi. And Allison there quotes an unnamed, high-ranking, serious Russian, high-level Russian official, unnamed, who said to him, and this is before Ukraine, we are confident that when Obama sees the whites of the Iranians' eyes, he will realize that he has nowhere to turn to for help but to us. End of quote. First of all, that tells you that they perceive Obama as weak, irresolute, and divided, and Europe as even more so. So I think that's the calculation. They see us as weak, yet sinister. It is a uniquely paranoid, but institutionalized paranoia kind of view that you have when you have a Russian type of government and process of threat assessment and intelligence reporting. That's a whole other series of arguments that could be discussed at a later date. But it's not that he thinks that the West will support it. He thinks that they're too weak to oppose it.
I do agree with what Steve said. I probably would want to emphasize that still there is a bit of a change in Putin. And he used to, for many years, consider it very important to be recognized as equal by the Western leaders, to be accepted to the clubs, to be kind of able to rub shoulders at the important summits. That was, for him personally, very important. It changed. It changed gradually. You probably cannot exactly pinpoint the moment of that change, but I think what triggered that change, maybe, was the big disappointment in the West, undisguisable, when he decided to come back to claim the presidency.
Right.
And he thought that his return would be greeted as very natural, as the right thing. Finally, that's a place where he belongs. And he saw, to his dismay, how disappointed the West is. How yes. So probably one point of change. But yes, he certainly now sees himself as by no means a peer to those Western leaders, but something very superior. He lives in the league of his own. I think that's a point Merkel was trying to convey to Obama.
Thanks. Lady with the camera, give her the microphone.
Hello. I have two quick questions for Mrs.
Just introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm so sorry. My name is Jennifer Lee Oprahori, and I'm a freelance filmmaker. I'm working on a documentary in coordination with an Medill School of Journalism professor about the plight of the Tatars in Crimea. So The first question I have, these are both for Ms. Izmirli, and I'm going to try to keep them as short as I can.
Speak up.
Oh, I'm sorry. The first question is, how do you think Putin and pro-Russian forces on the peninsula will treat the Tatars? Like, is there another deportation, like the one that occurred in 1944, a possibility? Do you think he'll treat them more like he does the Tatars of Tatarstan, or will he try to marginalize and dominate them as he has done with the Chechens? And then my second question kind of takes a turn, and that's just how do you explain Crimea's Prime Minister Sergei Aksynov's sudden rise to power, considering that his party, Russian Unity, barely won any seats in the parliamentary elections before the Russian invasion?
So let me start with Aksyonov question. You're right, his party got only 3% of the seats actually, so he suddenly rose to power literally under the gunpoint. So because of his Russian Unity, he's the president of Russian Unity, which is one of the anti-Tatar groups and also anti-NATO groups. When I was there, a Partnership for Peace program, NATO ship Advantage came to Crimea in 2006, and there were lots of groups in Feodosia protesting for a month against this situation. And his people were one of the instigators of this event in 2006. 2008, 2009, you constantly see that. In 2012, there was a big fire in the Büyük Cuma Cami, it's called in Crimean Tatar, it's like a cathedral mosque, they call it. Since 2004, they were trying to get the land title for the mosque, and finally they were able to get it, and there is a trailer in front of the mosque too. So there was like a Molotov cocktail situation there, and there was a fire, and after that event there was an attack to Crimean Tatar neighborhood. This actually was filmed somehow, and it went viral on the internet, and nobody was punished, but you can literally see the faces of these Russian Unity members, and that's the thing. The other thing is that I wanted to mention is, for the last 20 years, they've been training children against an enemy. Enemy doesn't have a face, but I've seen the photos because I have some connections with the pro-Russian groups, and they showed me like the target practices that they take these 12-year-old, 13-year-old boys and girls, but mostly boys, and they train them, and it includes like the army training that we have in the United States, and they were training them against the enemy. Enemy, who could that be? Either the forced Ukrainization, so it's the Bandera people. I mean, this has been going on for the last 20 years. I know the internal dynamics, so I cannot maybe, I am blaming Putin, obviously, but if he didn't have this much inside help, I think this wouldn't be maybe that easy. I mean, literally the the Ukrainian army went to the Russian side overnight from the military even, because these people have so much support and these people were trained. You see the soldiers in Crimea, for instance, and they are wearing the Russian uniform, so they are dangerous, but they are still not going to do much. But when you see those masked people with the Georgian ribbons on their arms, they are the most dangerous ones because they are the Russian Unity. So, and who is the head of the Russian Unity? It's Sergei Aksyonov. He has so many connections, and this Salem, look into it, Salem, it's called the Mafia Group. He's very well connected with them, and he's also the head of the Russian Unity. This is how he became the president of Crimea right now. The first question you asked was, if I understand correctly, about the possibility of deportation of Crimean Tatars.
Essentially, how do you think Putin is going to treat, and the pro-Russian forces will treat the Tatars? So is a deportation a possibility? Do you think he'll treat them more like the Tatars of Tatarstan, or will he try to marginalize and dominate them like the Chechens?
First of all, when President Putin wanted to talk to somebody from Ukraine, one guy only, Mustafa Dzhemilev, who couldn't make it today, he's the Crimean Tatar leader. And when he went to Moscow, Mustafa Dzhemilev, Putin talked to him on the phone, but he addressed him as Mustafa Aga. Aga means older brother in Crimean Tatar. So Putin was very nice to him. He explained to him how good and wonderful everything is going to be for Crimean Tatars if they accept, Putin's offers. And Jamestown said, no, how about the Budapest Agreement, this and that, you know, things that we are talking about. So then he left, but this meeting, for instance, was arranged by the Kazan Tatars, by the Volga Tatars. Actually, the ex-president Vladimir Putin was the guy who facilitated the meeting. And now, when they are having the Kurultai in Crimea, they had 2 days ago, Volga Tatars were also in this picture. So Volga Tatars are trying to convince the Crimean Tatars that it's not that bad under the Russian. You know, look, what did Ukrainians give you so far? I know you are supporting Ukraine, but you will be better under the Russian Federation. So the problem is, again, this is Putin, and I would like for you to see, please, if at all possible, it's two different dynamics, because Putin is still in Moscow. I know he's the boss, I know he's in charge, but if anything happens overnight in Crimea, things can happen. Like Bülent Ecevit so many years ago, when he was promising that we are not going to invade Cyprus, the Turkish army was already invading Cyprus. So things like that very common in politics, and this is what the Crimean Tatars are afraid of. They are face to face with this enemy who has been training their youth for the last 20 years. And now what? You know, so I hope this answers the question, or maybe raise more questions. So.
Thanks, you did. Maybe last two questions, Walter and then Fatima. Walter?
Very quick, very quick question. One
Introduce yourself, Walter.
Zaritsky, Walter Zaritsky from the Center for U.S.-Ukrainian Relations. Quick question is on soft power. How far is the West, and this is probably to Steve and Pavel, how far, and probably to Adele on this issue also, how far is the West ready to go in terms of soft power, in terms of bringing up not only the issue of the different nationalities in the Russian Federation and their rights, but even the rights of the Ukrainian minority in Russia, which we've raised that issue. 2-3 years ago, we had a major forum about it, and the existence not only of the national rights but religious rights. I mean, we know that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kiev Patriarchy has a problem, but so does the Ukrainian Catholic Church, even more in Russia. That's one. And then on the second question, very quickly on hard power. The question is, Pavel and Steve both raised that issue of he's willing to go further. Is it possible that it's not that he's simply just playing ad hoc? Is there a possibility that he thinks that with the other bad boys on the planet, the North Koreans, some of his allies perhaps in Latin America, we heard that Argentina may post base there, Syria, Iran, and so on and so forth, possibly even China. I mean, does he think that he may have enough wherewithal to pull some of this and have allies? And that's the two questions I'd like to pose.
Maybe Steve?
Let's try and take another question.
Okay, let's have both then. Yeah. Fatima, is it related or close?
No, it's
different. Okay, let's throw them all on the table. Let's see.
And then we'll
yeah.
I'm Fatima Tlesova, Voice of America Russian Service. My question is about Vladimir Putin. Almost all of the speakers spoke about his personal role in the whole event. So we saw in his two first terms he managed to build some personal connections with the leaders in Germany, in Italy, in UK, even in the United States, in Venezuela, Arab world. When he returned to the third term, there was no friends anymore. Almost everybody was gone. So, do we know anything about his probably attempts or intention to build new personal connections in the world?
Yeah, that's the question now. Yeah. She just proposed it.
Pavel, you want to start?
All right.
Thank you.
Yes,
Switch on the mic.
Very good. I don't think I have real answer to these questions. I can only speculate, particularly about. No, I don't think it works. Yeah, very good. About kind of what is in Putin's head, to what degree he is missing that feeling of having peers and friends and the likes of kind of Berlusconi and Schroeder with whom he can kind of relate. For what I can see, the only personal connections that is still significant for him, because he can hardly hope to build anything of the sort with China. There is always a cultural gap which is unbridgeable. The only personal relations which is still there, sort of, is Erdogan. And I think that underscores a very important role of Turkey in this whole setting. Oh. Why the issue of Crimean Tatars are more important than just kind of the size of that minority. It resonates there. So I think Putin will try to move extra cautious as far as Turkey is concerned. And why for the West it is very important to have Turkey on board in any collective action which might follow in this regard. Because I personally think that closing the Black Sea Straits for the Russian Navy, well, it will be a violation certainly of Montreux Convention, but nevertheless it's something which can be done collectively and which Turkey can be very, very eager to do. About soft power and hard power. As far as soft power is concerned, I don't think the West should try to counter one kind of ethnic discourse with another, to go into this game at all. Yes, it is possible to kind of, there are some opportunities there, but I think it is a very dangerous game to engage, and it is entirely possible for the West to take a more principled stance, saying we just do not accept the point about the right to protect your ethnic competitors anywhere, full stop. And that is a soft power in itself. With hard power, yeah, this definition is always problematic. What exactly, how hard this should power be, how not to overplay, how not to trigger overreaction, because with Putin now, the range of possible reactions have extended really very far. There is no way of knowing how he will suddenly put nuclear weapons into play, what sort of next step there might be. There is a big black box related to the nuclear weapons. So I think the uncertainty here is very high.
With regard to Fatima's question first, it's true that there's a new cast of characters over the last few years in the West than what he was used to. But I think part of the problem is also what has happened inside Russia, because he's been czar, and that's a fair description of his power, for 15 years. And for the last 15 years, people have been telling him that he is the savior of Russia, and that he can do no wrong, and what's more, that he has all the power to do whatever he wants, and the Russian government now believes he can do what it wants, if you read Johnson's Russian list in the interviews with diplomats last week. That, therefore, he doesn't think he needs those people anymore. He is, in his mind, probably superior to them, and he, he's in another universe, as Merkel may have suggested. He's also cognitively, and this is a fundamental principle that nobody in this town wants to accept, that Russia's cognitively living in another universe. But anybody who really understands the system knows that. So I think there's that. So the difficulty of establishing a personal connection is real. But to be honest with you, I think this whole idea of a personal connection with the ruler of Russia is vastly overdrawn and estimated. The fact of the matter is, every American president has tried to have a personal connection with Yeltsin or Putin or whoever was before them, and I'm old enough to remember all of them, and it didn't do very much for us at all. It's a waste of time. We're dealing government to government, and there has to be a relationship of confidence, obviously, but this kind of way of, the famous line of Harry Truman writes in his diary, I always felt that if I could only find someone to whom Stalin could unburden himself, we might do better. Now, we're not much more advanced. This is a sort of an indication, again, why we need more expertise and better, not just more. In regard to the hard power and stuff, to me, there's nothing soft about Russian power. What there is a lot of information warfare out there, and attempts to corrupt and subvert elites, political institutions, social institutions, etc. But I don't think that Russia really can compete in that field, although they're spending a fortune. Corruption is not soft power. I mean, there's Dostoevsky said if you want to bind people to a conspiracy, you make them complicit in a crime with you. I don't find that to be soft power. And what's more, nobody really gravitates Russia out of soft power. They gravitate out of money and opportunism and corruption. I think that's a fundamental point. Again, as with Pavel, I would not accept any of these ethnic arguments. The R2P argument is wholly spurious. As Paul said, there was nothing going on in Crimea. There was no threat. There was no violence. Yes. And it's not Iraq, as Michael McFaul would have us believe. This indicates, I think, some defects in Michael's education.
No, I was asking a different question. I was asking a very different question. I was asking a question first. I was asking a question about whether whether using soft power we can raise the issue of national minorities in Russia and religious minorities in Russia, because that is a problem.
Absolutely.
That's one. And the second was, if both of you say that these losing friends, you know, and using the bad deodorant with the West, has he started hanging around with the bad boys and feels that the North Koreans are going to do something stupid, and the Syrian Assad is going to do something stupid, and the Iranians, and keeps that over our head, while he's the one manipulating him into doing that?
I don't think he can manipulate China or Iran, frankly. Or North Korea. I don't know anybody who can manipulate North Korea, or for that matter, China. I mean,
Syria.
He may try to align himself with what they're doing, or threaten that if we come after them on Crimea, they will, you know, scuttle the Iranian talks. Quite frankly, I don't think they will, because they have much more to lose from a nuclear Iran than we do.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, yes, necessarily, because an Iranian nuclear weapon allows Iran to play in Caucasus and Central Asia, and to challenge the Russians in the Middle East if it ever becomes necessary. The states that are most threatened are Israel and the Gulf, and I would argue Russia and Azerbaijan from an Iranian nuclear weapon. Now, what this might do is drive him into a greater dependence on China. And there are people in Beijing who clearly think that way, because the economy will be deprived of its natural Western outlets. But I don't think he can do that. I think because the whole mantra of his foreign policy is the independence of Russia. And the point is that if Russia is to be independent, it certainly does not want to be led into crisis by Kim Jong-un, for whom I doubt he has much respect. And he certainly is not going to let China drag Russia into a war in Asia, if you look at Asian policy. So I don't think that's the answer there. Now, as far as minorities in Russia, I would look, the more publicity we give to what's really going on in Russia, the more we bang the table about human rights and the violation of international agreements that Russia has entered into, and the fact that it is demanding things for Ukraine that it's not willing to observe in its own country, absolutely necessary. That is soft power. There's no violence or anything else. But the way the Russians play the game, I don't think there's anything soft about Russian power.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Soft power for Russia, I suppose, means we threaten to do it instead of actually beating you over the head. Two last concluding points I would like to make. Given what we've heard this afternoon and other discussions, I think it may be dawning upon us that the last 23 years in Europe may have been an anomaly. In other words, democratic development, relative peace, other than Yugoslavia, of course, relative peace, unification, and this period is now coming to an end, thanks to the actions of Mr. Putin, which he's prepared for many years. And the second point, I think, is what we're facing is a confrontation, a very naked confrontation between a postmodern Europe and all that entails, a Europe that feels it's somehow risen above history, very complacent, materialistic, if you like, consumer-oriented, and what I would call a pre-modern Russia. And I think this is a confrontation that Europe, I don't believe on its own can handle, not without the United States. This is why US leadership, again, as it's happened several times in the last century, is absolutely essential. And I think the best way, and I hope our leaders are up to it, and the best way to preserve the postmodern is to help to eliminate the pre-modern. And I'll leave it at that. Glenn, I don't know if you want to... Okay, thanks very much all for coming.
I gave you the paper with the emails, right? I gave you the paper with the emails, right? Okay. I'll be right back. I'm not.
Оленка, ти маєш свою нову карту, я буду знову збирати людей на нашу Ти залишилось того, що ти маєш імейл, я все ставлю дивлюсь. Бачите, ми беремо збирання до досить буде.
Ну, тепер буде більше людей, не тільки...